It is a bright, cold morning in the year 950, and you are going to market. But before you leave the house, you do something that would look very strange to almost anyone alive today. You do not count out coins into a purse. Instead, you take down a small cloth pouch, loosen the string, and tip the contents into your open palm. And what falls out is not money in any shape you would recognize. There are 1 or 2 whole silver coins, yes, stamped with curling letters you cannot read, but most of it is broken. A snapped-off length of a woman's arm ring, half of a flattened brooch, a coin that someone, long ago, chopped cleanly in 2 with a chisel, a little curl of melted silver no bigger than a fingernail, scrap, you might think, rubbish. And you would be completely wrong, because this handful of battered fragments is your fortune, and by the end of this morning some of it will make you richer. Then you pick up the second thing, the tool that makes the whole system work, a small folding balance, its 2 little pans no wider than a coin, and beside it a neat set of weights, because in your world, silver is not counted, silver is weighed. So stay with us morning, because a single day at a Viking market is about to show you an economy stranger, cleverer, and reaching far more of the world than almost anyone gives these people credit for. Let me set you down in the right place first. You are walking towards Hedeby, and there are few better places in the whole Norse world to understand how ordinary people made their living. Hedeby sits at the very neck of Denmark, on a quiet arm of water called the Schlei, on the frontier where the Scandinavian north rubs up against the Frankish south. It is not a village. By the standards of the age, it is something close to a city, a crowded wooden town of perhaps 1,000 to 1,500 people, packed inside a great curving earthen rampart that loops down to the shore. Inside that wall, the ground is a grid of narrow plank-laid streets and small timber houses, workshops crammed shoulder to shoulder, smoke rising from 100 fires, the whole place smelling of tar and fish and forge smoke and animals. Down at the water, jetties reach out into the harbour like fingers, and against them lie the ships, low and sleek and clinker-built, their overlapping planks patched and weathered from long voyages. And the crowd, this is the thing you would notice most. You hear Danish, but you also hear the harder sounds of Frisian traders, the speech of Franks and Germans and Swedes, the tongues of Slavs from the eastern shore of the Baltic, and now and then a stranger from somewhere so far away that no one on the street can name it. This one small muddy town is a knot where the trade of half a continent pulls tight. Now, to the first surprise, the one already sitting in your palm. In this market, there is no such thing as a price in coins the way you would think of it. Money here is silver, and silver is measured by weight, full stop. This is what historians call a bullion economy, and it works completely differently from ours. A coin is not worth a fixed amount because a king says so and stamps his face on it. A coin is worth exactly as much as it weighs in good silver, no more and no less, which means a coin and a chopped lump of an old brooch and a snapped ring fragment are all fundamentally the same thing. They are silver, and their value is their mass. That is why every serious trader in this market carries a set of small folding scales, often beautifully made, that pack away into a neat little case, together with a purse of carefully made weights. When you strike a deal, you do not hand over 3 of this and 2 of that. You pile your silver scraps into one pan, the seller sets the agreed weights in the other, and you both watch the beam until it hangs dead level. Everyone here is, in a real sense, walking around with their own portable bank and their own portable mint, weighing out wealth a few grams at a time. Which brings us to those broken fragments, and to the second thing that would startle you. The Norse deliberately destroyed beautiful objects to make this system work. That snapped piece of arm ring in your hand was once a whole, gleaming band of silver worn with pride on someone's wrist. That half brooch was once a fine ornament pinning a cloak at the shoulder. And at some point, without a flicker of regret, somebody laid them on a block and cut them apart. Historians have a name for the result. They call it hacksilver, and the market ran on it. When a payment did not come out to a round number, you simply took a knife or a chisel and cut a piece of silver down until the scales balanced. A ring became 2 rings, then 4, then a scatter of nameless chips. Think about what that really means. In your world, a magnificent brooch is worth precisely its weight in scrap silver and not 1 grain more. The craftsmanship, the beauty, the hours of work, all of it counts for nothing on the beam of the balance. Wealth in the Viking market exists not to be admired but to be chopped up and spent. And here is where the story quietly opens out onto the whole of the known world. Turn one of your whole coins over in your fingers and look at it. It is thin, it is bright, and it is covered in flowing script that means nothing to you at all because it is Arabic. That coin is a dirham, and it was struck thousands of miles away in the mints of the Samanid emirs in Central Asia, in cities near the old Silk Road. It did not walk here. It was carried hand to hand up the great rivers of the East, the Volga and the Dnieper, by Norse traders the Eastern peoples called the Rus, who paddled and portaged their way deep into a world of forests and steppes to reach the edge of the Islamic Caliphate. There they traded for silver, and that silver came pouring back north by the ton. We are not guessing at this. Archaeologists have pulled tens of thousands of these Islamic dirhams out of the ground in Scandinavia, especially on the Baltic island of Gotland, buried in hoards so heavy they can only mean one thing. This cold northern market, this town of wood smoke and fish, was awash in silver minted on the far side of the world. The money in your pouch is a physical thread running all the way from a Danish jetty to a mint in the deserts of Asia. But a market like this does not simply happen. It has to be protected, and it has to be paid for. A town like Hedeby lived under the shadow of a king or a powerful chieftain, and that ruler did two things in exchange for the wealth that flowed through his harbour. He offered a rough peace, a promise that within the rampart, on market days, a stranger could trade without being robbed or knifed for the silver in his purse, and that quarrels would be settled by custom rather than by blood. And in return he took his cut, a toll on the ships that tied up at the jetties and on the goods that crossed them. The market also breathed with the seasons. Through the long light half of the year, from spring to autumn, the sea roads lay open and the harbour was thick with masts, traders arriving from every direction while the weather held. Then winter closed the seas, the ships were hauled up onto the shore, and the town turned quiet and inward until the ice let go and the whole restless business began all over again. So what are all these people actually buying and selling? Walk the plank streets with me, because the sheer range of goods laid out is astonishing. Here are furs, stacks and bales of them, bear and fox and marten and otter and beaver, brought down out of the far north by the Sami and the Finns and the traders of the Russian rivers, destined for the cloak of some wealthy lord in the warm south. Here are lumps of raw amber, the golden fossilized resin of the Baltic, prized everywhere for beads and amulets. Here are walrus tusks, the ivory of the north, hauled from the freezing seas around the top of the world. Here is iron in rough bars, and slate whetstones for putting an edge on a blade, and sealed pots of honey, and dried fish stacked like firewood, and strings of bright glass beads, and, from unimaginably far away, a fragment of shimmering Chinese silk that has crossed an entire continent to end up in a stall on the edge of Denmark. And here, and there is no gentle way to say it, are human beings. The slave trade was one of the darkest engines of this whole economy. Captives taken in raids and wars, the people the Norse called thralls, were bought and sold in these same markets alongside the furs and the amber, and shipped south in their thousands. Half the known world passes through one muddy northern street, and not all of it is beautiful. And the market is not only a place where things are sold, it is a place where things are made. Between the trading stalls sit the workshops, and the noise of them never stops. Listen for the steady rasp of the comb maker, one of the busiest craftsmen in any Norse town, working red deer antler into fine-toothed combs, cutting and riveting and polishing, turning out the single most common personal object of the entire Viking age. At the Danish town of Ribe, archaeologists have dug up the leavings of these comb workshops by the sackful, thousands upon thousands of antler offcuts, the debris of an entire industry. Nearby, a jeweller casts brooches and pendants in bronze and silver, a bead maker melts and winds molten glass into little coloured spheres, an amber worker grinds raw resin into shining ornaments, a leather worker stitches shoes and belts and scabbards. The Viking market is a factory and a shopping street and a bank all at once, and the ordinary people who worked these benches, not the raiders, were the real backbone of Norse wealth. And this is exactly how an ordinary Norse person, with no royal blood and no warband, could grow genuinely rich. The secret was to stand in the middle. A fur that a northern hunter would part with for a trifle might be worth many times its weight in silver to a lord in the warm south who had never seen a living marten, a trader who bought cheap in one world and sold dear in another, who knew which goods were scarce where, and who was willing to risk the long sea road between them, could turn a light purse of hacksilver into a heavy one in a single good season. That is why the scales themselves became a mark of who a person was. When archaeologists open the graves of these towns, they find men, and sometimes women, buried with their folding balances and their little sets of weights laid carefully at their side, exactly as a warrior might be buried with his sword. To be a weigher of silver, a person who dealt and measured and travelled, was an identity worth carrying into the next life. The market did not only make people wealthy, it made them somebody. Now for the hard human truth underneath all of it, because a market that runs on chopped up silver has a very obvious problem. If money is just weighed metal, how do you know the metal is real? How do you know that bright coin is solid silver and not a lump of cheap lead with a thin silver skin? The answer is that in this market you trust no one, and you test everything. Pick up almost any piece of Viking silver from the ground today, and you will see the evidence, small vicious little marks all over its surface. The Norse had two habits for this. One they call nicking, small knife cuts notched into the edge of an ingot or a ring to see how the metal gives. The other they call pecking, sharp jabs stabbed into the flat face of a coin with the point of a knife, each one throwing up a tiny curl of metal. If the blade sank in too soft, there might be lead hidden inside. If it skidded too hard, there might be too much copper. Judging the difference took real skill, and it was probably the work of experienced specialists. Every peck and nick is a moment of suspicion frozen in metal, a trader saying, in effect, "I do not believe you, prove it." And to stop cheating on the other side, on the weight itself, the whole system leaned on carefully made standard weights, so that a merchant in one town and a merchant in another could agree on exactly what a payment should weigh. And it is those humble little weights that hold the twist in this whole story. Look closely at the ones a Norse trader tips out beside his scales, and you will notice they come in two very particular shapes. Some are neat little cubes with their corners shaved flat, others are squat little barrels, rounded like tiny beads. These are not random Scandinavian lumps of lead. Their shapes, and more importantly their weights, follow a foreign standard, an Islamic one, tuned to a unit the Arab world called the mitkul, weighing roughly 4¼ grams. Many were made in the Islamic East and carried north with the silver, and others were copied faithfully in Scandinavia to match. Sit with what that means for a moment. The entire measuring stick of the Viking economy, the invisible ruler against which every deal in furs and iron and slaves was judged, was calibrated to a standard set in the great cities of the Caliphate. A Danish farmer haggling over a fur in a cold northern town was, without the faintest idea of it, obeying the accounting rules of Baghdad. These raiders and settlers we imagine as fiercely self-reliant had let the mathematics of a distant empire quietly govern their idea of value. And the deepest irony of all is that this ingenious weigh-everything world was already living on borrowed time, because within a generation or two, the first true royal coins would be minted in the north around the year 995, and kings would begin to stamp their own authority onto silver and tell people what it was worth. The endless chopping and weighing would slowly fall away, and the strange, brilliant economy in your palm would fade into history. So let us end back where we began, with that pouch of broken silver. It looks like a handful of rubbish, and it is one of the most remarkable things in this entire story, because in those few scraps you are holding a map of the world. There is silver from Central Asia, ideas of weight from the Islamic South, a fragment of a Baltic arm ring, perhaps a chip of a Frankish coin, all mingled together in one small purse on the edge of Denmark. The Viking market was, in its way, the internet of its age, a place where furs from the Arctic and silk from China and silver from the deserts of Asia all changed hands within a few muddy feet of one another, and the ordinary Norse who thrived here, the traders and craft workers and weighers of silver, did not grow rich by hoarding what they had. They grew rich by moving it, by standing at the crossroads and taking their small cut as the wealth of half a continent flowed through their hands. So weigh out your few grams, watch the beam settle level, and close your fist around your fragments of a dozen different worlds. On a cold market morning in the year 950, an ordinary Norse person did exactly this, and in that simple, careful act of laying silver on a scale, they were reaching out and touching the whole of the known earth.